Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with Michaël Kusters, Chief Strategy Officer at SDWorks. In the first part, we explored the social contract of the employee experience. Today, we look at the machine behind the growth. Michaël shares how he manages a serial acquire strategy, why he believes architects should be simplification experts, and the personal mistakes that helped him build a playbook for European success. So let's dive back in. Do you want to sharpen your skills as an enterprise architect? Welcome to Verbonden, the podcast where we combine insights from experienced professionals with real-world examples from the world of architecture. My name is Elise Luijks, and I am your guide through the layers of enterprise architecture, making it less mythical and more concrete. Now we have talked about, I call this one is the soul of HR a bit, which is the experience. Now I want to move on to the second part, which is more where I will be looking for how to build the machine that supports this.
Yeah.
Because you just mentioned you can offer 7 different things, options, or different benefits for your employees. That a lot of IT people really don't like that kind of complexity, because that's a lot of, if you write code, if then else, otherwise, and maybe in this case, and if he's called Michaël, then. That kind of complexity, how do you look at those and balancing those?
It's a very good but also hard question. So as an organization, and we spoke about customer relationship earlier, as an organization, this is what we do. We offer the solution to actually make those choices easy to consume and take away that complexity from our customers. Why? In order to give people choices and to enable it. 1, 2, that complexity will only grow stronger. We're in the center of Brussels here, very close to the Belgian Parliament. That contains 150 members of Parliament who think every month of new ways of, in a way, adding more complexity to it. And so we know that we all sometimes dream of less complexity, but the reality is it's like an endless lasagna with layer upon layer of new complexity, whether it comes down from European Parliament or from employer organizations or from unions or from Belgian Parliament. We live in a world that is increasingly getting regulated. That regulation can only be consumed through systems and programs and solutions. And basically that's what we do as an organization. But the dream that the complexity would go away, we always think of it. I don't think so. I think it will only get more complex and more regulated. And technology is the only way to master that complexity. And maybe for a programmer it's not the most fun thing to do, but if you come to think of it, HR is the mother of all rules. It's, for this employee of this age with this location, you need to apply this tax schedule or this wage component kicks in. This is the essence of the existence of a company such as ours. It is to master the complexity brought on by HR and payroll and time registration and all those things. There's a really hard side to HR. Oftentimes we love to think of HR as, the nice and warm and fuzzy people in the office. The reality is there's a very hard side to HR, which is more driven by regulatory, by compliance, by IT, by technology, bringing that together. And it's only when you get that right that you can really talk about culture and the atmosphere in the office and connecting as a team. If you don't get the basics right, doing all the other stuff in HR is very, very hard.
Yeah, guys, it's a way to the quicker that technology or processes in an extension, and the system of the organization can absorb things like the legislation and the compliance issues, the faster they are at absorbing those, the more time and energy and balance that there is to really look at, are people happy, giving a quality onboarding, offboarding,
improving employee experience, working on that relationship. And conversely, if you screw up the compliance bits and you have a wrong tax deduction or an error in a P-slip, it's very hard to go fix that employee experience and make it right again. So it's not just getting it right one time, it's getting it right all the time. Because if you break it once, you touch a form of trust and people lose confidence. And so it's a very tricky bit. People think, just a HR service provider or a payroll provider will deal with all this complexity, and they will. But it really there's very little tolerance for error.
Yeah. I sometimes in my work, I also use the concept of what things does your client look at as it's logical. I expect it to be okay.
Yeah.
Like it's like if you're an employee somewhere, you expect your wages to be there at the end of the month.
Table stakes.
So if it doesn't happen, it's like a big breach of the expectation of the trust. And then you have what I usually call the delighters there, which is if you go for the first time to a company, it's your first day. And the first thing is there's someone who takes time for you, who goes, do you want a coffee? And they take the time. That's like what I call the delighter. It's
going above and beyond.
Going above, yeah, exactly. Which is like finding the right balance.
But also there, you can only go above and beyond if the basics are right.
Yeah.
If you spend half a day onboarding on a new job and it's really great, and 2 weeks later you get your first pay slip and it's wrong, your entire experience is ruined, and even to have the onboarding will, you probably won't perceive it as good as it was at the time.
Is this way of thinking, is it triggered by specific frameworks or models that you use to look at customers or experiences?
But I think one of the key elements is really this idea of customer experience and really making sure you build everything around it. And then also I think the touch point thinking is an important one, to really imagine what the impact is of a poor touch point, an error in a payslip or whatever. And it's maybe not a framework, it goes back to a core human thing, which is empathy. Imagine yourself in that situation. For us, it's, there was a 50 euro error in a payslip, it's 50 euros, it's not too bad. For that employee, it's not about the 50 euros. It's about, you got it wrong. There was an error. You promised, there was this implicit promise of getting it right. The amount doesn't even matter.
Yeah, it's a sense of security, or it could be, if you look at empathy, for the one person it would be very bad. It's like really a sense of anxiety or security. For the other person it would be the social contract, like the expectation, it's not
yes, but at the end of the hour, salaries for most people, it's the majority of their income.
Yeah.
Once you reach trust around the majority of your income, it puts stress on something, because there's always something to be paid, whether it's a mortgage or a vacation or something, but it's very, very essential. It really touches the basics of work. And work is a social contract between, here's my service, here's my talent, here's my capability, and I get money in exchange. Yeah. If you start to mess with that exchange, you touch something very deeply.
When you are building strategies or in your day-to-day work, is there a way how you try to do the sanity check on this? Because you're very clear, and maybe you are also well trained in this way of thinking?
I think it's always go back to pragmatism. Don't get carried away by three-letter acronyms or possibilities by technology. Bring it back to real-life situations. Even a very complex situation, very complex strategy needs to be implemented by people, by technology. You need to enable processes. Then just don't overcomplicate. Don't make it overly complex. Bring it back to basic principles and and to basic metaphors and communication devices that can be mastered. I think our technology enables a lot of things. You always have to bring things back to its core simplicity.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And only invite the complexity that is really required for.
Yes, we live in a world that is incredibly complex. And making things complex is actually not so hard. It's a lot harder to make things simple.
Yeah.
And I also typically work with very different stakeholders, going from M&A folks to marketing people to our colleagues, our employees, to external stakeholders. If you cannot articulate your strategy in a simple way, it's impossible to address this to those different stakeholders. So you have to bring it to this level where everybody can get it. And depending on the stakeholder, you can really hone in on financial details or on HR details or whatever. But you have to bring it back to its simplest form, its purest form. And then it will carry over, because otherwise you're stuck with the level of complexity that only few people can absorb. And then you can't roll out strategy. If you can make it simple, you reach a lot of people, and then the chances are higher that you can make it work.
And you mentioned also the merger and acquisition, the M&A context. Architects often talk about fit, and you have complexity of two organizations at some point. There might be a fit on paper, reality it can be more challenging. How do you look at merging two organizations through the M&A lens?
I think it's a podcast in itself just on this particular question, but I'll try to answer it as best as I can. So we are a serial acquirer, right? So we acquire businesses, a few businesses a year. And in the past, we were relatively accommodating as to what people could do. We've changed that approach entirely. And across SD Works as a business, we've created a baseline set of processes, whether it's enterprise architecture, whether it's our systems, but we've really created a standard which we can use as a foundation for the businesses we then acquire. And then we also make choices about our security systems, our CRM systems, our finance systems that we roll out to all these businesses. Also there, that standard operating level is a very important one. In our case, we're typically the bigger one, and then we acquire smaller organizations, so we can do that. It would be probably different if you have a merger of equals or something else. But it's very important to have clarity on the foundation, and then clarity because it gives you clarity on the destination. It gives you clarity on where you want to go if your foundation is clear. There was a time when we did our first acquisitions 5-6 years ago when we weren't quite clear, and then we struggled. Because then you need to explain to that business that you just acquired, well, maybe we could do this or that, and how do you think about that?
You're more negotiating in the position.
Yeah, but at some point you're negotiating against yourself.
Yeah.
And an acquired business is also looking for clarity. People can deal with a lot, but very few people can deal with unclarity. And the clearer your goal, the easier your integration. So if you say, people can get stressed by timelines and by overcoming complexity, but if you just make it very clear, in 6 months we would like to have our CRM system rolled out. And then you can start a debate around which difficulties to overcome. but at least you define a clear goal, and maybe it's 7 months, but still, you've done this migration of systems or integration in a relatively short period of time. Yeah. If you leave it open-ended and you let the complexity take over, it's very hard to get you to your goal.
Yeah, I also hear that it helps that you have done it a few times, so you have the experience and you can come almost with, can I call it like a playbook?
Yes,
and how to do, yeah.
We've only gotten to the playbook by making a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
So we've been, and then we've learned, we fixed those mistakes, and the important thing is to learn from those mistakes. The issue is not to make the mistake, and the important thing is, not to acknowledge it as a mistake and then not learn from it. So we've learned it by doing.
Yeah, that's a nice question. How to make sure that you learn from mistakes? Yeah.
By enabling a feedback loop. By making sure you go back to the mistake instead of people have typically, I made a mistake, carpet, and it goes under the carpet and we never talk about it. You got to go back to that painful moment when you realize it was a mistake and say, what was the thing you wouldn't want to do again? I'll give a case in point. We made an acquisition 4 or 5 years ago where we said we're going to leave the business alone. We're going to let it run for a year on its own and not get involved too much. But it was a business that was previously owned by private equity, and the private equity people had very strict metrics and a management system. Okay. And all of a sudden that was gone. And we left them to their own device, up to the point that they came back to us and asked, can you please, so 3-4 months into the acquisition, they came back to us, said, can you please integrate us? Because we would like to go back to this system of getting the instruction and knowing where to go.
If I may have for one more question, because I learned that you have experience working with enterprise architects in different contexts. As your role as Chief Strategy Officer, how can enterprise architects, and from their point of view, support you or get more traction with leadership in your views? Or where do you see let's first start with what is the intersection, what is the touch point for you?
I work in 2 worlds. So there's a more commercial world where I work with enterprise architects or enterprise architects on how can we best shape our offering to customers, but also commercially, how can we organize upsell opportunity, and how can we make the consumption of our solutions as frictionless as possible. The second world that I work in is more M&A around, how can we overcome the complexity of doing an integration and what are the different steps we have to go through. In the first one, I think it's really around frictionless. How can we, put that customer experience or employee experience, but put the experience central and then work your way backwards. I think there's this famous piece or a quote by Steve Jobs where he really says, if you design a product, start with the experience and work your way backwards. I love that. And I think that enterprise architects can really play an important role there because oftentimes they start from the complexity, but if you put the experience first and then work your way through the complexity, I think that's really how I look at it. And it's you should probably look it up on YouTube. You'll find a quote somewhere, but it's really a nice way to articulating where to go, building frictionless experiences. Yeah. And M&A, it's a bit different. It's not an experience, it's really about a form of unification, of coming together of organizations, but it's a similar journey of, where you want to go, you have not 2, but typically multiple different systems. How can you bring that together into a unified world? I mean, it sounds, when I reflect on what I'm saying here, it sounds very simple. It's super hard, but it always goes back to that sort of, in the one world, experience layer or level, in the other world to that unification and streamlined business processes level. to your point about what can enterprise architects? I think it's think about the business objective, put that front and central. Don't get lost in the business complexity or in the business process complexity. Ask in a number of cases, why do we even care about that business process? Should we not? The best simplification is just take out the business process. And I see that now with a number of AI opportunities. We want to automate some things. Sometimes we just the best way of simplifying is just not do it altogether. If it's not strictly necessary for the business. And so I think enterprise architects can play a very interesting role as a challenger in organizations to say, why do we need it? Is this really necessary? Aren't there simpler ways? And in a number of cases, not everywhere, I don't want to oversimplify, but in a number of cases, you can be the simplification architects, where you simply say, look, if we know that this is the end goal, what is the simplest way of getting there? Rather than, all these building blocks need to be put in place. Sometimes, there's simpler ways. So that's it. We live in a super complex world and super complex organizations with more layers of compliance and regulation, and then technology which evolves not every month but every week or every day these days. Bringing clarity in that complexity becomes an art form in itself. And I think enterprise architects, because they're so savvy and know about the business process and about the technology, it can be like a navigator towards simplicity.
Thank you very much, Michaël, for sharing your insights.
It felt more philosophical than enterprise architects at times, but if you're happy, I'm happy.
What a pragmatic look at the world of strategy. My favorite takeaway: making things complex is not hard. Making things simple is an art form. Thank you, Michaël, for showing us how to be the navigators in this complex world. If you enjoyed this two-part series, please leave a review and share with your colleague who is navigating their own lasagna of complexity. Until next time, stay connected. Many thanks to Pieter-Jan Rombout for producing and editing, and to Leonard Busset for the intro music. And of course, thank you for listening, and see you next time